Welcome back to Non Projects. Today we are back on the 1973 Dodge Dart project. Last time we were on this, we got the Torqueflite 727 rebuilt. So now we're just about ready to get the fresh 360 and 727 mated up and dropped into this car. Before we do that, we got some detailing work to do in the engine bay. We got to drop the old Slant 6 904, so that's what we're going to start off with. And obviously this needs to get cleaned out. It's been sitting outside for a long time, so let's start tearing into it. Let's get the transmission out first. Alright, so we just need to disconnect some lines. I think the transmission mount's already loose. We'll slide the transmission jack under there and should have this out in just a minute or two. Alright, transmission is out, and we made a sufficiently huge enough mess on the ground, so we'll have to deal with that once we roll it out. But now let's finish tearing down everything else in the engine bay. A lot of this stuff is not going to get reused, so we just need to clear it out so we can start cleaning up. Alright, so that's most of the stuff out of the engine bay. The wiring we're probably not going to reuse just because we're changing a fair bit. I also dropped the drive shaft and exhaust, so I think we're ready to drop the car back onto the ground, roll it out, and we'll get to pressure washing. Alright, we got all the gack off. Now just to bring the paint back a little bit, I'm going to use some fine steel wool and just go over everything, and we'll see how it looks after that. Alright, so now that we got the engine bay cleaned up a little bit, we need to modify our K-member for our conversion mounts. Only the driver's side mount needs to be modified. So we're going to have to cut some material off and also drill a new hole. Otherwise this interferes with the engine. So here's our mounts. It's a pretty sweet setup. Definitely beats switching out the K-member. So you can see here what I was talking about. We'll measure an inch down from the bottom of the slot that's there right now. We'll drill a 9/16 hole, and then we'll remove this material above. And it looks like this picture is actually to scale, so that's helpful, but to drill the hole we'll just measure an inch down. So let's go mark the hole and do it. Alright, so we're just going to take our calipers and I'll walk it at an inch. Not rocket science, you don't have to be exact to the 10,000th. And then we're just going to measure down and mark. That should do it. Compare it to the printed to scale version. We're looking close enough, so now we'll just grab a small bit and get a pilot hole started. Do the same on the back side. And now we just drilled up to 9/16. Now for our final size, 9/16. Alright, now we'll just mark our cuts here. Alright, so there we go. Modified K-member. So now the car is pretty much good to go to accept all the new stuff, so we need to get the engine and transmission mated up. So let's turn our attention there. Alright, so a couple things we gotta do before we get the engine up and off the stand. First of all is getting our motor mounts installed. So here's how they go on. We're gonna just install them finger tight so that we can adjust the position of the engine in the car. So this is the left side mount. We're on the driver's side, obviously. Somehow in the diagram they got both bolts in like that. Not that it really matters, but no clue how that happened. So we're also going to need to do some slight modification to our flex plate. Since we're using a Magnum flex plate with an LA converter, that it is neutral balance though, we need to drill one of these holes out and just elongate it a little bit. So you can see if we line up 3 of our flex plate holes, the 4th one is off center, so we're going to drill that so that we can put a bolt in. Alright, so there you go. I got the hole elongated down here so we can fit all 4 bolts in. So we can go ahead and bolt our flex plate back up to the engine. Alright, I went ahead and got the engine up and off the stand. Now we need to get our final core plugs in. So we'll just sand the sealing surfaces for the plugs just to get any chunky rust or anything like that off. We'll use some of this non-hardening sealer. I'll just line up our plug and drive it on home. Alright, should be all good there. Then I'll just do this one. Alright, plugs are in now for our flex plate. It is weighted, so it only fits in one way. Or lines up, rather. Then I like to throw a little bit of blue thread locker on there. And these get torqued to 55 foot-pounds. There we go. Then finally I'm just going to scrape off any of the paint that's here on the bell housing mating surface, just to remove any thickness that might mess up how the transmission mates to the engine. So scrape all this off real quick and then turn our attention to the trans. Now we're ready to mate the engine and transmission up. It'll be a little tricky by yourself, but we'll see how this goes. Looks like luckily it's not going to be too bad. Sometimes the transmission has to get lifted up to actually mate up with the bell housing bolts on the block, but this is going to be easy. There we go. Start getting our bell housing bolts in. Oh, seriously? Oh no, I'm just retarded. So one thing that a lot of guys make a big deal out of, which it kind of is a big deal, but it's not. It's easy to not have an issue, is making sure that the torque converter is seated. So you saw, if you watched the 727 rebuild series, that's when we threw our new torque converter on the transmission. There's a few clicks or like humps or noticeable bumps that the torque converter goes over as it seats into the pump, the input shaft, and the stator support. All that you need to do to verify, I've seen guys get crazy with this. They make like flat bars that go across the bell housing. They measure down to the pads on the torque converter. Not necessary unless you're doing some kind of weird mismatch where you're putting a transmission that never went with an engine together. All you got to do is, once they're bolted up like this, just make sure the torque converter spins free, which ours does. That means that there's plenty of clearance between the torque converter and the flex plate. If there's no clearance, then the flex plate pushes the torque converter way back into the transmission, and you'll burn the pump up. Then our two larger diameter bolts go into the transmission in the bottom holes. Alright, I got all the bell housing bolts torqued up. This one is going to need to come back out for our transmission dipstick tube. But for now we're just going to leave it. I think now we're ready to get this thing lifted up and dropped in the car. So let's start pumping and pushing. We may end up needing to trim a little bit away on the modified part of our K-member in case it interferes with the block, but we're going to give it a go and see how it does. We may need to pull it back out, but that's okay. Try not to take out our brake line. Alright, now we're going to throw a jack under the tail shaft of the transmission just to get us leveled up and out. And then we should be able to just drop our motor mounts in. I need to yank our distributor off, or at least the cap, we'll see. Yeah, no big deal. Gonna go ahead and get our bolt in on the driver's side. So the through bolt for the motor mount is on for the drivers. And then on the passengers, you see we got this U channel, so we're gonna lift up on here, which should make the motor tilt like that, and then we'll toss our bolt in and it should settle down on it. There we go. It's sat in the car. Now there is some adjustment we need to do, but before we get the engine square this way, we need to get the transmission up and in. So down under, it's super simple. I'm just going to bolt our new transmission mount up and then put our cross member back on. Here's our new transmission mount. It's a polyurethane bushing. I was surprised how dang expensive these things are, but looks like a good enough piece. So go bolt this up and then get the cross member on. I just realized I accidentally got the early transmission mount. I think 73 they swapped to the mount that's on the old transmission. So for now I'm going to reuse the old transmission mount. It needs replaced though, but it'll help us locate the engine for now. Alright, so the new transmission mount came in, so I went ahead and got that in place. So the transmission should be approximately where it's going to end up being. Before we level the engine out and get the motor mounts all torqued down, we need to get the headers in, because there's a good chance we're going to need to lift the motor up a little bit to get the headers to squeak by the steering box. Headers are never any fun to put in, but we'll see how these go. We want these polished Summit Racing branded headers for the A-bodies with a 360 or 318, I guess. So they're generally well reviewed, so we'll see how they fit. I guess we should start with the hard side first, steering box. Alright, I guess I'll just leave the camera rolling and probably fast forward through my suffering. Okay, maybe that's enough. Alright, had to drop the tie rod, which needed done anyways, so no big deal. Maybe now it'll slide up in it. Alright, I think the car needs jacked way up. Otherwise I'm gonna have to move the steering box out of the way. So close. I think if we get the engine up, it'll be good. Alright, I think the steering shaft needs to come out now. That's awesome. You know what, at this point I'm kind of just thinking it's going to be easier to hook the crane back up, drop the transmission mount, and basically take the engine back out to put the header on. Oh my gosh. Guess I should have thought about that. Bet you it'll go in now. Now he's got to keep it up. Zip tie. Alright, let's get the passenger in while we got the engine up. Although I think that would just slide in, but I'm not going to assume anything. Let's hope there's no dimpling we're going to have to do, otherwise we're going to do this a few times. Back down we go. That was a lot of fun. Now I just got to get the transmission bolted back up, and the pitman arm goes right between the header on the driver's side, so the pitman arm goes through the header and then the tie rod goes, yeah, I'll show you. Actually, I think we're good. Never mind. Alright, so we're sitting back down on the transmission mount. The motor mounts are obviously sitting there. They're going to need adjusted and tightened up. But let's get the headers bolted on and we can check for any clearance issues. We're already hitting something. And that would be the motor mount boss, since this is a Magnum motor. Sweet. Alright, so here's where we're interfering on our headers with the truck mount boss on the Magnum block. So you could grind the boss down on the block. I'm just going to ding these with a ball peen. It makes zero impact on performance, and that's going to be easier than getting under there with a grinder, so I'll work away on that. Alright, after battling back and forth, the header's on and torqued. We seem to have good clearance to everything. So now on to the passenger side, which I discovered does go up easy even with the engine in place. It looks like we are just hitting the torsion bar, so we'll give it a good ding there, and then the passenger should bolt right in. Nice and easy. Alright, passenger header's on. I actually had to ding it quite a bit, you can probably see, to clear the torsion bar. So that's something to keep in mind if anybody else is going to use one of these Summit headers. Overall, they're pretty decent, but they did take a little bit of massaging. So now we will go ahead and get our engine level. So I'm going to put a little bit of tension on the chain with the hoist. We'll lift it up. Right now it's leaning towards the passenger side just a little bit, so we'll bring it up just a hair and then we'll torque all of our motor mount bolts. Alright, so I think we will wrap up here for now. Probably a little bit of a short video, but it wasn't short for me. The header battle took a while. So next time we're on the engine, we're going to be tackling the accessories. Kind of an oddball setup because we're using the Magnum serpentine setup, but we have LA heads on a Magnum block. Kind of oddball compared to what most guys run. The only hang-up we're going to have is that we're going to have to fabricate our own power steering pump bracket because the cylinder head doesn't have the proper holes cut into it, but it shouldn't be a big deal between those studs in that one hole above the core plug. We can use a plate of steel and make a good bracket, so that shouldn't be too crazy. So that's what we'll be working on next time we're in the engine bay. Also working on swapping the rear end. This has a 7 1/4. Obviously that's not really going to handle the 360 very well. It'll probably blow up pretty quick. So instead of going with a Mopar rear end because they're scarce and super expensive, like an 8 3/4 or an 8 1/4, we're going to go with a Ford 8.8 and shorten it. So that'll probably be the next time we're on this thing. So I will see you then. Should be an interesting process on the rear end. So.